Hello, co-authors. Without your comments, this story won't be finished. Let's go create together. In New Orleans, the night never sleeps. It breathes, sings, dances to a rhythm that is impossible to pin down, but can be felt if you let the city get under your skin. Bourbon Street, lit by neon signs and lanterns, rang with the voices of tourists, the laughter of street performers, and snatches of music pouring from the open doors of bars. In the heart of this chaos, on a corner where the old brick facade bore the marks of a century of rain, stood the Blue Crescent Jazz Club. Its sign, faded by sun and time, promised more than just music. It beckoned like the whisper of an old friend who knows your deepest secrets. Tom Rivers, the 42-year-old owner of the club, stood at the bar, polishing a glass as if his life depended on it. His dark hair, slightly gray at the temples, was combed back, and his shirt sleeves were rolled up to reveal strong forearms accustomed to hard work. Tom was not a handsome man in the classical sense, but there was something magnetic in the way he moved, in the way he tilted his head as he listened to each musician. His eyes, deep as the Mississippi, could tell a story without a word, and those who had known him long said that there was always a spark in them, either passion or stubbornness or something altogether elusive. "Tom, old man, are you at it again?" Charlie, the bartender with a face like carved oak, nodded at the glass in his hands. "This glass is already shining like a Christmas display. Give it a rest." Tom grinned, the corners of his lips twitching, but his eyes remained far away. He set his glass down on the bar and looked around the room. The Blue Crescent was his brainchild, his heart, built of brick, sweat, and sleepless nights. Wooden tables stained with spilled whiskey, a stage where every creak of the floorboards held memories of the great and the forgotten, and the air saturated with the smell of tobacco and Creole spices. All of this was his world. But today, something in this world was trembling, like a string stretched to its limit. On the stage, under the dim light of a single spotlight, stood Lily. She was 39, but time seemed to pass her by. Her chestnut hair, pulled back into a messy bun, hung in loose curls that brushed her neck, and her midnight-colored dress emphasized the curves of her figure that still made the men in the audience hold their breath. She sang "Summertime," and her voice, low and husky, filled the room like smoke, enveloping everyone who dared to listen. Lily was more than just a singer, she was magic, the very thing that made New Orleans breathe. And Tom, standing at the bar, looked at her as he had looked at her 1,000 times before, but each time it was like the first time. "She's still the queen, right?" Charlie poured himself some coffee from an old tin mug and nodded toward the stage. "You and her are like something out of an old movie. Romeo and Juliet, only with a saxophone." Tom chuckled but didn't answer. He remembered the first time he and Lily had met. It had been here, at the Blue Crescent, 15 years ago. The club was on the verge of closing, and Tom was an unknown with a guitar and a dream. Lily had come to the audition, wearing a cheap dress and carrying herself with such confidence that it was as if the stage had belonged to her since birth. She had sung "My Funny Valentine," and Tom, sitting in the empty room, had realized that he was lost. They had married a year later, and their duets, his guitar and her voice, had become the stuff of French Quarter legend. Locals called them the king and queen of jazz, and even tourists who wandered into the club felt they were witnessing something more than just music. But time is not kind even to legends. Tom rarely picked up his guitar now. The club's affairs consumed him entirely. Accounting, contracts with suppliers, disputes with landlords, trying to keep the Blue Crescent afloat in a city where bars grew and died like moths. Lily, on the other hand, seemed to blossom with each passing year, her voice growing deeper and her energy brighter. She still lit up the room, but Tom noticed how her gaze sometimes slid past him, to the young musicians who came and went, leaving behind a trail of ambition and cheap cologne. "Tom, are you okay?" Charlie's voice broke him out of his thoughts. "You seem kind of off today." "It's okay," Tom waved it off, but his fingers involuntarily tightened on the edge of the counter. He couldn't explain what he felt: worry, fatigue, a premonition that the melody of his and Lily's life had begun to sound out of tune. Lily finished the song, and the crowd erupted in applause. She smiled, bowed slightly, her eyes glittering in the spotlight. But instead of looking for Tom, as she usually did, she turned to the guitarist, standing in the shadows of the stage. Ryan, the new kid in the band, was young 28, with wild hair and the cocky confidence that comes with age, when you don't yet know how easy it is to break. He smiled back, and there was something in that brief exchange of glances that made Tom's chest lurch. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but it felt like someone had yanked a note out of his melody. "Charlie, pour me a bourbon," Tom said, looking away from the stage. "And don't water it down." Charlie raised an eyebrow, but said nothing as he pulled out the bottle and poured the amber liquid into a glass. Tom took a sip, feeling the warmth spreading down his throat, but the cold inside him didn't go away. He looked at Lily, who was now chatting with Ryan, her laughter ringing like a bell, and for the first time in years, Tom felt like a stranger in his own club. The night flowed like a river, smooth and relentless. The Blue Crescent was a hive of activity, tourists ordering cocktails, locals arguing over who played the trombone better, and the music flowing without interruption. Tom moved around the place, greeting regulars, making sure everything was in order. He had always been good at this, keeping things under control, preventing the chaos of New Orleans from engulfing his little world. But today his mind was elsewhere. He remembered Lily telling him once that their love was like jazz, an improvisation where everyone knows their part, but together they create something greater. He had laughed then, put his arms around her, and they had danced right there on the empty stage to the sounds of an old gramophone. But now he wondered, what if she had started playing a different tune? What if he was no longer part of her improvisation? "Tom, are you coming to the after party?" Lily's voice pulled him out of his thoughts. She was standing next to him, already dressed in jeans and a light blouse. Her hair was loose, and in her eyes there was that same spark that had once made him fall in love. But now there was something unfamiliar in that spark, almost defiant. "Not today," he said, trying to keep his voice even. "We have accounts to close, and the supplier is holding up the beer again. Someone has to keep this place afloat." Lily rolled her eyes, but her smile remained soft. "You're always with those bills. Relax for once, Tom. Come over and have some fun." Ryan promised to play something new. Ryan's name was a casual note, but it cut into her ears. Tom looked at her, trying to catch what was behind her lightness, but Lily had already turned away, adjusting her bag on her shoulder. "Maybe later," he said, although he knew he wouldn't. "Sing for both of us there, okay?" She laughed, touched his hand fleetingly, almost mechanically, and went to the exit, where the musicians were waiting for her. Tom watched her go, and a feeling grew in his chest that he could not yet name. It was not just doubt, not just fatigue. It was a feeling that his world, so familiar and dear, was beginning to slip away like sand through his fingers. By midnight, the club was empty, except for a few regulars finishing their drinks and a janitor lazily sweeping up cigarette butts at the entrance. Tom sat in his tiny office backstage, surrounded by stacks of papers and the smell of old wood. There was a bottle of bourbon on his desk, but he didn't touch it. Instead, he stared at a framed photograph of him and Lily 10 years ago, laughing, hugging, with the Mississippi in the background. Her eyes had been so clear then, so alive. He tried to remember the last time she'd looked at him like that. The door creaked, and Charlie peered into the office. "Okay, boss, we're closing up. Are you going home?" "Soon," Tom replied, not taking his eyes off the photograph. "Just give me a couple of minutes." Charlie nodded, but didn't leave. He stood leaning against the doorframe for a moment and finally said, "You know, Tom, I'm not one to butt in other people's business, but you might want to talk to Lily. She's been acting different lately." Tom looked up, his eyebrows twitching slightly. "Another? What do you mean?" Charlie shrugged, clearly regretting having brought this up. "I don't know. Just keep an eye on her, okay? New Orleans is a city of temptations. And Lily, she's like fire. Sometimes she burns those who get too close." Tom nodded but said nothing. When Charlie left, He leaned back in his chair, closed his eyes, and inhaled the scent of the club, a mixture of whiskey, tobacco, and something elusive and alive. He knew Charlie was right. New Orleans was a city where hearts broke as easily as melodies were born. And for the first time in years, Tom felt his own heart, accustomed to the rhythm of jazz, begin to skip a beat. It was a summer evening in New Orleans, thick as syrup. The air, thick with Mississippi moisture and the scent of jasmine, clung to people's skin, making them move more slowly, speak more softly, and feel more intensely. At the Blue Crescent, the lights were low and the music as lively as the heartbeat of the city. The stage, lit by a single spotlight, was an island in a sea of shadows, and on that island, Lily Rivers prepared for her evening performance. She stood at the mirror in the small dressing room offstage, adjusting her earrings, the simple silver hoops Tom had given her for their 5th anniversary. Her fingers lingered on the metal, but her mind was elsewhere, not with Tom, not with the club, but with something new that was stirring her blood. Lily looked at her reflection. The woman reflected in the mirror could still make a room hold its breath. Her eyes, the color of dark honey, sparkled under a layer of mascara, and her lips, lightly touched with scarlet lipstick, held the hint of a smile that could be both a promise and a warning. She knew she was beautiful, but in recent years that beauty had become more armor than a gift. Life with Tom, once full of fire, had become a habitual rhythm, a metronome measuring out the days filled with bills, rehearsals, and conversations that were becoming shorter. She missed feeling alive, her heart beating not in time with the music, but in response to someone's gaze, full of desire. The dressing room door creaked and Ryan Duper appeared. He was 28 years old and looked like he had stepped out of a rock and roll movie poster. His hair, dark and slightly curly, fell over his forehead, and his denim jacket, worn but fitting, emphasized his lean but strong frame. Ryan was new to the Blue Crescent, having joined the band only a few months ago, but he had already become the talk of the bar. His guitar playing was brash, almost impudent, with notes that grabbed you and wouldn't let go. But it wasn't just his music that attracted Lily. There was something wild about him, like a hurricane that hadn't yet decided whether to destroy everything around it or just pass by. "Ready to rock the place, Queen?" he asked, leaning against the doorframe. His voice was low and slightly husky, and it carried the same energy as his chords, confident but not intrusive. Lily turned, her lips twitching into a smile. "A queen, you say? Careful, Ryan, such words can turn heads." "I don't mind." He stepped closer, and a spark flashed in his eyes that took Lily's breath away. "Someone needs to remind you that you're not just a singer in this old bar." She laughed, but I was a little nervous. Ryan always said it that way, lightly, as if his words meant nothing, but each time they left a mark on her, like a pebble dropped into calm water. She turned to the mirror, adjusting her hair to hide the slight pinkness in her cheeks. "This isn't just a bar," she said, trying to keep the conversation casual. "This is the Blue Crescent. This is where stories are made, Ryan, and hearts are broken." "Oh, I believe you." He came even closer, now standing so that she could feel the warmth of his body. "But you know, Lily, I think you deserve more than to sing for drunk tourists and local old men." His words touched something inside her, not hurt, but longing. Lily knew he was right, but she didn't want to admit it. She loved the Blue Crescent, loved its smell, its sounds, its history. But in recent years, the club had become a cage for her, beautiful but cramped. Tom, absorbed in business, was no longer the man who had once looked at her as if she were a miracle. Now his gaze was absent-minded, focused on the bills or the crowd, but not on her. And Ryan looked at her as if she were the only woman in the world. "Be careful, boy," she said, trying to return her tone to playfulness. "Such talk can lead to trouble." "I like trouble," he said, his smile both challenging and inviting. He handed her the bottle of water, and their fingers brushed for a moment. Lily felt a jolt run through her skin, and she quickly looked away, afraid he would notice her pupils dilating. "Go tune your guitar," she said, turning away. "The show's in 10 minutes." Ryan chuckled, but obediently walked out, leaving behind a faint scent of cologne and something else freedom, maybe danger. Lily took a deep breath, trying to compose herself. She knew she was playing with fire, but the fire was so inviting. On the Blue Crescent stage, the evening was in full swing. The room was buzzing like a beehive, with laughter, the clink of glasses, and snatches of conversation merging with the chords of the pianist setting the rhythm. Lily walked out on stage to applause, her dress shimmering in the spotlight like the surface of a river under the moon. She took the microphone, and her voice, deep and velvety, floated over the crowd, silencing everyone. She sang Stormy Weather, and every note was saturated with pain and passion that she herself did not fully understand. Ryan stood a little to the side, his fingers sliding over the strings, adding sharp, almost brash accents to the melody. Their eyes met as Lily reached the chorus, and for a moment it seemed as if the entire room had disappeared, leaving just the two of them, their music, and something growing between them like a storm gathering strength. She quickly looked away, focusing on the audience, but her heart was beating faster than the rhythm of the song. Backstage, in the shadows where the spotlight couldn't reach, stood Morris, the saxophone player who had played at the Blue Crescent before Tom took over. His eyes, narrowed and tired, watched Lily and Ryan with silent wariness. Morris was a man of few words, but he was as sharp as a hawk. He saw the way Lily's gaze lingered on Ryan, the slight twitch in her fingers as she handed him the microphone for the solo. System, solo outing. He saw Lily and Ryan exchange glances, and it didn't escape his notice. Morris, a man who knew the Blue Crescent like the back of his hand, didn't like gossip, but his instincts told him there was a storm brewing. He said nothing, just shook his head and walked over to the bar where Charlie was already pouring beers for the late-night guests. Lily finished the song, and the crowd erupted in applause. She took a bow, her cheeks flushed with adrenaline, and as she walked off the stage, she caught Ryan's eye. He winked at her, and she smiled back, feeling something tighten inside her, whether it was fear or excitement. She didn't know, but she liked it. In the dressing room, Lily took off her earrings and dropped them on the table, her fingers shaking. She stared at her reflection, trying to figure out who this woman in the mirror was. She loved Tom, or at least she loved the Tom who had once looked at her like she was a star. But Tom was gone, drowning in paperwork and problems, and she was tired of being his shadow. Ryan was different. He was alive. He was here now, and he looked at her like she was all he needed. There was a knock at the door, and Ryan walked in uninvited. "You were incredible tonight," he said, closing the door behind him. "That song, damn, Lily, it was like you took the soul out of everyone in this room." She smiled, but her voice was quiet. "Thank you, but it's just a job, you know." "Work?" He stepped closer, his voice softening. "No, it's not work. It's magic. You are magic." Lily felt her cheeks heat up. She wanted to say something, to laugh it off, but the words were stuck in her throat. Ryan was standing too close, and the air between them seemed to spark. She knew she should stop this, that it was dangerous, but her body, her heart, everything screamed differently. "Ryan," she began, but he interrupted. "Don't say anything," he said, his voice almost a whisper. "Just let it happen." Their fingers brushed again as he handed her the bottle of water, and this time she didn't pull away. She knew it was a mistake, but at that moment she didn't care. New Orleans was a city of temptations, and Lily, as a true daughter of the city, couldn't resist its call. The night in New Orleans was thick and sticky, like molasses running down the rim of an old jug. The streets of the French Quarter were hot, saturated with the smell of grilled shrimp, damp asphalt after a rain, and the sweet smoke of cigars smoked by tourists who wandered lazily from bar to bar. At the Blue Crescent, the evening was in full swing, the scratch of a saxophone mingling with the hum of voices, the clinking of glasses, and the laughter that seemed only half sincere. Tom Rivers stood behind the bar, his fingers habitually clutching the rag he was using to wipe down the already clean wood. He was here, in his own kingdom, where every corner, from the worn chairs to the faded posters on the walls, was a part of his life. But today, something in this realm felt alien, as if someone had quietly rearranged the notes in his favorite melody. Tom was a man who knew how to keep his cool. 42 years had taught him that in New Orleans, where passions flared faster than a match, calm was a weapon. He smiled at the regulars, joked with the waitresses, made sure the beer was cold and the music was just loud enough to drown out the street noise, but not his thoughts. But in recent weeks, his calm had begun to crackle like old vinyl under a needle. He noticed the little things, the way Lily lingered after rehearsals, her laugh a little louder when she talked to the new guitarist, Ryan, or the way she avoided his gaze when he asked about her plans. These little things were like pebbles that accumulate in your shoe, individually unnoticeable, but together they began to hurt. Charlie, the bartender with the face carved from driftwood, stood across the street, pouring bourbon for a couple of tourists in bright shirts. His movements were precise, almost mechanical, but his eyes were watchful, like a man who had seen too many nights in this city. Charlie was an old friend of Tom's, one of the people who had known the Blue Crescent since before Tom had bought it from its previous owner. He rarely interfered in other people's affairs, but today his silence was as heavy as the air before a storm. "Tom," Charlie coughed, putting the bottle on the shelf. "We need to talk." Tom looked up, his brows furrowing slightly. "What's wrong? Did the whiskey supplier let you down again?" "Not about the whiskey," Charlie said, lowering his voice, though the room was loud enough that no one could hear them. He pulled his phone out of the pocket of his plaid shirt, hesitated for a second, as if deciding whether to continue, and handed it to Tom. "Take a look. But keep a cool head, okay?" Tom picked up the phone, his fingers shaking slightly, not from fear, but from the sense of foreboding that had been gnawing at him for weeks. On the screen was a video taken in the dim light of a street lamp outside the back door of the club. The camera was shaky, as if the person filming was afraid of being seen, but the image was clear. Lily, in the black dress she wore for her shows, stood close to Ryan. Her hand was on his chest, his fingers were on her waist, and their faces were so close that he could see her lips curve into a smile before they met in a kiss. It wasn't a passing fancy. There was a confidence in the movement, as if this had happened before. Tom watched the screen, and the world around him seemed to slow down. The sounds of the club, the clinking of glasses, the laughter, the chords of the piano receded like waves, leaving only the dull thump of his own heart. He didn't feel angry, didn't feel the urge to smash the phone or storm into the dressing room where Lily was probably changing after the show. Instead, he felt a chill, not the bone-chilling kind, but a deep, visceral one, as if someone had turned off the light inside him. "Who took this?" he asked, his voice flat, almost lifeless. Charlie shrugged, avoiding his gaze. "One of the guys who cleans up after shift. He didn't want to butt in, but thought you should know." Tom nodded, handing the phone back. "Thanks, Charlie. Don't tell anyone, okay?" "My job is to pour, not to talk," Charlie replied, but there was a hint of sympathy in his tone. He turned to the tourists who were already waving at him for more, leaving Tom alone with his thoughts. Tom stood still, his fingers still clutching the rag, but now he was staring into space. The video he had just seen was more than just proof of betrayal. It was a knife stabbing into his past, into his and Lily's history, into the love he had thought unbreakable. He remembered Lily dancing on the empty stage of the club, her singing for him alone, her voice shaking with emotion as she confessed her love for him. Now those memories seemed false, like a cheap knockoff of vintage vinyl. But the fury he was expecting did not come. Instead, something else was growing in his chest, a cold, sharp determination, like a blade that had just been sharpened. He was not going to make a scene, or scream, or punch the walls. Tom Rivers was a man who knew how to tell stories, and he had decided that this story, the story of his and Lily's love and betrayal, deserved a stage-worthy ending. Lily wanted to play with fire. Well, he would give her a fire she would never forget. When Lily walked into the room, her hair was damp with sweat and her eyes were shining from the performance. She was wearing jeans and a light blouse, but even in casual clothes, she looked like a star. She smiled at Tom as she approached the counter, and her voice was light, almost carefree. "So, boss, the room was mine today, wasn't it?" She leaned over to grab a bottle of water from under the counter, her hand brushing his. Tom forced a smile, though his lips felt alien. "You always know how to get 'em going, Lil. Best in town." She laughed, tossing her hair back. "Just the city. I was aiming for the entire state." He looked at her, and there was no trace of what he had just learned in his eyes. He had learned to keep a straight face back when he and Lily had fought for every cent to keep the club afloat. He had hidden from her the debts, the overdue bills, the landlord's threats. Now he was hiding his pain and the plan that was beginning to form in his head. "Are you going to the after party?" she asked, finishing her water. "Ryan says he and the guys found this new bar on Royal Street. They say they serve cocktails that make you forget your name." Ryan's name jarred on his ears, but Tom didn't show it. "Not today," he said, shrugging. "We need to check the accounts. Someone has to make sure we don't go broke." Lily rolled her eyes, but her smile was soft. "You and your bills. Live a little, Tom. When was the last time you danced?" "When was the last time you asked?" he countered, his voice as light as hers, but inside he could feel the cold spreading through his veins. She laughed, touched his shoulder, briefly, as if it meant nothing, and walked away toward the exit where the musicians were waiting. Tom watched her go, and each step she took was a note in a melody he no longer wanted to hear. He knew Ryan would be there in this new bar, with his cheeky smile and his hands on his wife. But Tom wasn't going to run after her, wasn't going to make a scene. He was a man who knew how to wait, and his revenge would not be a scream, but a performance carefully calibrated, like a jazz improvisation, with every note in its place. By midnight, the Blue Crescent was empty. The last of the guests staggered out onto Bourbon Street, where new adventures awaited them. The janitor, an old Creole named Jacques, swept the floor and hummed in French, and Charlie counted the takings behind the bar. Tom sat in his office, a cramped room behind the stage that smelled of old wood and ink. There was a stack of bills on his desk, but he didn't look at them. Instead, he held an old photograph of himself and Lily at the Jackson Square Festival, their faces beaming, the river flowing lazily behind them. He tried to remember the last time she had looked at him the way she did in that photograph, but the memory slipped away like smoke. The door creaked and Charlie peered inside. "That's it, boss. I'm closing. Are you okay, going home?" "Soon," Tom answered without looking up. "Give me a couple of minutes." Charlie nodded, but didn't leave. He stood there, as if deciding whether to speak, and finally said, "Tom, I didn't want to show you this, but you had to know. Lily, she's good, but this town, it changes people." Tom looked up, and there was that calculating glint in his eyes that Lily hadn't noticed, but that Charlie had seen right away. "I know, Charlie, and I'll figure it out." Charlie nodded, knowing better than to push the issue. He walked away, leaving Tom in the quiet of the office, the only sound the old clock ticking on the wall. Tom leaned back in his chair, closed his eyes, and let himself feel the pain, sharp as a blade, but he refused to let it take him. Instead, he began to think like a chess player calculating his moves. Lily wanted freedom, she wanted youth, she wanted Ryan. Fine. He would give her a stage to shine on, only to have her fall from it in front of the entire city. The next day, Tom was the same as always, or almost the same. He joked with the waitresses, discussed the new Godwin with the supplier. System. Ordering a new beer, checking the register, saying hello to the band. But inside him, a storm was raging that no one could see. Lily was laughing and chatting with the band backstage, and Tom was watching her from behind the bar, his face an impenetrable mask. He knew she wouldn't notice his gaze, and that was for the best. He needed time to gather his thoughts, to turn his pain into a plan. "Tom, why are you frozen?" The voice of Morris, the saxophonist, broke him out of his thoughts. Morris was older than Tom, with deep wrinkles and a look that had seen too much. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "Just thinking," Tom shrugged, trying to look casual. "How do you like Ryan? The guy plays like the devil." Morris chuckled, his eyes narrowing. "The guy's playing for attention, And Lily, she's too bright for him. And for you, to be honest. Tom felt his throat tighten. Morris was always direct, but now his words were like a punch to the gut. What are you getting at? Because I'm not blind, Morris lowered his voice. And neither are you. Be careful, Tom. This town loves to break hearts. Tom nodded, but his mind was already elsewhere. He looked at Lily, who was laughing at something Ryan had said, and his fingers curled into fists. He wasn't going to share his pain with Morris or anyone else. His revenge would be his own, and it would be perfect. As the days passed, Tom began to piece together his plan. He contacted the organizer of the Crescent City Jazz Festival, an old acquaintance named Louis, who owed him a favor for saving a couple of nights at the club. Tom pitched an idea, a grand performance by Lily with a multimedia show that he said would be a tribute to her talent. Louis was thrilled, unaware that Tom had already arranged for a technician to prepare a special video sequence. He began collecting evidence. One of the cleaners, the one who had filmed the video, agreed to help, feeling guilty about showing Tom the truth. They set up a hidden camera behind the stage, in a secluded corner where Lily and Ryan often lingered after shows. Each new video was like another blow, but Tom watched them with a cool calm, turning his pain into fuel. Lily didn't notice. She was too busy with her new passion, her dreams of glory, which Ryan fueled with his compliments and promises. She talked to Tom about the festival with such enthusiasm that he almost felt remorse almost. But every time he closed his eyes, he saw her with Ryan, and that memory drove him forward. The weeks leading up to the festival passed quickly. Tom spent his days in the usual routine smiling at Lily, discussing the repertoire, checking the accounts. But his nights were spent alone in his office, lit only by a desk lamp and with playlists and secret notes lying on his desk. He edited videos, choosing the precise moments that would show Lily as she was and how she had betrayed him. One evening, a week before the festival, Lily walked into the office, her eyes shining with anticipation. Tom, did you hear? Louis says this is going to be my best performance. They want to make a star out of me. Tom smiled, his voice soft as velvet. You are a star, Lil, and I'm going to make sure the whole city sees it. She didn't notice the shadow in his words, didn't see how his eyes turned cold as steel for a moment. She hugged him, and he hugged her back, but his embrace was empty. He was no longer the Tom who loved her without looking back. He was a man preparing a play, and Lily was its protagonist, unaware that the stage was about to collapse. The night in New Orleans was as lively as a jazz jam, unpredictable, full of sharp chords and pauses that made your heart skip a beat. The streets of the French Quarter were damp, saturated with the smell of chicory coffee, roasted oysters, and old wood steeped in the spirit of centuries. At the Blue Crescent, the lights were dim, and the stage was empty. The evening concert had ended, and the hall, recently buzzing with applause, was now as quiet as a river before dawn. Tom Rivers sat in his office, a small room behind the stage, where the air smelled of ink and dust, and something elusive and alive, as if the walls echoed with every note played in this club. His fingers were on the table, next to a stack of bills, but he did not look at them. Instead, his gaze was fixed on the screen of an old laptop, where the images that had changed his life flickered in the dim light. The video Charlie showed Tom was more than just proof of Lily's betrayal. It was a note out of tune, a crack in the melody he thought was his. Lily, his Lily, whose voice had once been his home, kissed Ryan, the young guitarist with a cheeky grin, in a dark corner behind the club. Tom watched the video over and over, not because he wanted to torture himself, but because he wanted to find meaning in it, or maybe confirmation that it wasn't a dream. But each viewing only strengthened the cold resolve that was growing in his chest like a storm gathering strength over the bay. Tom Rivers was a man who knew how to tell stories, not just with words, but with scenes, with lights, with music. He knew how to make an audience hold their breath, how to build a performance so that every note would hit the heart. And now he decided that his next story would not be about love, but about truth, cruel, merciless, but fair. Lily wanted to play with fire. He would set her afire that would light up all of New Orleans. But to do this, he needed time, connections, and a plan that would be as precise as his favorite jazz composition. The next morning began with the usual bustle. Tom stood outside the Blue Crescent, waiting for a truck to deliver a new order of beer. The driver, a stocky man with an alligator tattoo on his forearm, was unloading crates, grumbling about the traffic on Canal Street. Tom nodded, signed papers, but his mind was elsewhere. He had already made the first move. He had called Louis Baptiste, the organizer of the Crescent City Jazz Festival, a man who knew the New Orleans music scene better than anyone. Louis was an old acquaintance, indebted to Tom for the few nights. The Blue Crescent had saved his reputation by providing a stage for his performances when other venues refused. Louis, Tom began when they met at a small cafe on Decatur Street that served bayonets with so much powdered sugar it settled on your clothes like snow. I want Lily to perform at the festival. Main stage, prime time. This is her year. Louis, a man with espresso-colored skin and eyes that had seen too many deals, narrowed his eyes. Lily, she's a star, sure, but the main stage isn't just that, Tom. It's big names, big money. Why now? Tom smiled, his voice smooth as a river. Because she's ready. You know how she sings. Give her a chance, and she'll steal the show. And I'll add something special. A multimedia show to highlight her story, her journey. Louis leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping against his coffee cup. Multimedia, it's expensive, Tom, and complicated. We already have a technician, but I'll arrange it all, Tom interrupted, his tone confident but not insistent. I have someone who will do it perfectly. You just give us a stage and time. Louis looked at him, as if trying to figure out what was behind that smile. But Tom was a master of disguises he could persuade without revealing his intentions. Finally, Louis nodded. Okay, Tom, for old time's sake. Lily's performing on Saturday at 9 o'clock. The best time, but the show's on you. Tom shook his hand, feeling the first chord of his plan ring clear. He hadn't mentioned that the multimedia show would not just be a tribute to Lily's career, but her downfall. He hadn't said that every frame he planned to show on the giant screens behind the stage would be a knife piercing her reputation. Louis couldn't know no one could know until the moment arrived. Back at the club, Tom took action. He contacted Jean, a videographer he knew from their days shooting commercials for local bars. Jean was skinny, with nervous movements and eyes that were always looking for something no one else noticed. He was perfect for the job, unobtrusive, but alert, like a hawk stalking its prey. I need you to take some pictures, Tom said when he met Jean in a dark alley behind the club, where the smell of trash bins mingled with the scent of jasmine. But it's not for advertising, it's personal. Jean narrowed his eyes, taking a drag on his cigarette. Personal, you say? You don't seem like the type to spend money, Tom. What's the story? Tom paused, choosing his words. He didn't want to give everything away, but he knew Jean wouldn't work unless he knew why. Lily and Ryan. They're closer than they should be. I need proof, and I want you to edit it with her old performances, the ones where she sang about loving me. Jean exhaled smoke, his lips curling into a wry smile. Oh, Tom, this is going to be messy. Are you sure? I'm sure, Tom replied, his voice as hard as granite. But it has to be perfect. No one can know until the time comes. Jean nodded, stubbed his cigarette out on the wall, and walked away, his footsteps lost in the noise of the street. Tom was left alone, looking up at the dark sky, where the stars barely made it through the city lights. He felt his plan beginning to take shape, like notes forming a melody. But this melody wasn't about love. It was about truth, about pain, about how a person can become both a victim and a judge. Tom spent the next few days in the shadow of his own club. He smiled at Lily, discussed songs with her, helped her choose a dress for the show, but his mind was elsewhere. He watched her, not obsessively but carefully, noticing the way she lingered after rehearsals, the way her fingers brushed Ryan's arm when she thought no one was looking. Each moment was another note in his melody of revenge, and he collected them with cold precision. Gene worked quickly. A week later, he brought Tom the first footage, grainy but clear, shot in the nooks and crannies of the backstage area, where Lily and Ryan exchanged glances, touches, kisses. Tom watched the videos alone in his office as the club was closing, the light from his desk lamp casting long shadows on the walls. He didn't feel the anger he'd expected. Instead, he felt a strange calm, like a musician who knows his solo is going to be perfect. "This is just the beginning," Gene said, handing him the flash drive. "I can get more. They're not very careful." "Get it," Tom said, his voice quiet but powerful, like a river that moves slowly but can destroy everything in its path. "And start editing. I want Lily's old recordings, the ones where she sings My Funny Valentine or Blue Moon, woven into this footage, so that everyone who sees it will know that she betrayed not just me, but everything we'd built." Gene nodded, but his eyes were wary. "You're playing with fire, Tom. This isn't just a video. This is the end." "I know," Tom said, and there was no warmth in his smile. "But she's chosen her rhythm. I'll just help her play it." Every night, Lily shone on stage, her voice filling the blue crescent like smoke, enveloping everyone who listened. She sang of love, of pain, of dreams, and the audience responded with applause, unaware that her life was very different behind the scenes. Tom watched her from behind the bar, his face a mask of calm, but inside he was like a conductor preparing the orchestra for the climax. He knew that Lily dreamed of the festival, of thousands of people applauding her, of her name appearing on posters all over the city, and he was going to give it to her, but not in the way she expected. One night, after another show, Lily walked into the office, her cheeks flushed with adrenaline. "Tom, have you talked to Louis? He said everything is ready for the festival. The main stage, can you imagine?" Tom smiled, leaning back in his chair. "Sure, Lil. I told you I'd do it for you. You deserve to be a star." She came closer, her eyes shining. "You're the best, you know. Sometimes I forget how much you support me." Her words might have hurt him, might have reminded him of how much he loved her. But now they were empty, like an echo in an empty room. He nodded, letting her embrace him, but his hands were cold, as if he were holding a ghost. "I want this to be unforgettable," he said, looking into her eyes. "And believe me, it will be." Lily laughed, not noticing the shadow in his voice, and walked away, leaving behind a faint scent of perfume. Tom watched her go, his fingers tightening on the edge of the table. He was ready. His plan was like a score, with every note in its place, and he was going to play it perfectly. The evenings at the Blue Crescent passed as usual, but for Tom, each day was a step closer to his goal. He met Jean in secluded places, smoky cafes, alleys where no one asked questions. They discussed details, how to synchronize the video with the performance, how to make sure the footage appeared on the screens at the right moment, how to make sure no one knew about their plan until the very end. Gene was a professional, but even he sometimes looked at Tom with trepidation, as if he sensed that this story would end in more than just a broken heart. "Are you sure you want to do this?" Gene asked one day, handing Tom a new batch of frames. "This isn't just revenge. This is destruction." Tom looked at him, his eyes cold as the Mississippi in winter. "She destroyed us first. I'll just finish it." Gene didn't answer, he just nodded and walked away, leaving Tom with a flash drive full of evidence. Tom knew what he was doing. He knew that his revenge would not be just an act of anger, but a performance that would show Lily what it meant to betray someone who had given her everything. And he was ready to wait like a musician who knows that the most powerful note is played in the silence before the end. Summer in New Orleans was like a love song, hot, sticky, full of promises that were rarely kept. The streets of the French Quarter rang with the voices of buskers, their melodies mingling with the smell of fresh bread from the cafes and the salty wind off the Mississippi. At the Blue Crescent, the air was thick with anticipation, not the usual hum of an ordinary evening, but something more, something almost tangible, like the anticipation of a thunderstorm. Lily Rivers stood on the club stage, her voice deep and velvety, flowing through the room like wine through crystal. She was rehearsing for the upcoming Crescent City Jazz Festival, and every note she sang was steeped in a dream of glory, of a new life, of something more than the walls of this old club. Lily was in her element. Her dress, simple but form-fitting, showed off every curve of her figure, and her hair, loose and slightly damp from the heat, fell like dark silk around her shoulders. She sang, "I've got you under my skin," and her voice trembled with the passion she put into every word. The room was almost empty, just a few waitresses idly wiping tables and Morris, the old saxophone player, playing along with her with lazy grace. But Lily sang as if there were thousands in front of her, as if she were already standing on the festival's main stage, under the spotlight, with the crowd chanting her name. She closed her eyes, letting the music carry her away, and in that moment she was not just a singer in a small club, she was a star whose light could outshine all of New Orleans. Ryan Duper, the guitarist with the cheeky grin, stood a little to the side, his fingers sliding over the strings, adding sharp, almost defiant accents to the melody. He looked at Lily with an admiration he made no attempt to hide, and she felt his gaze like the warmth of the sun on her skin. Their connection, which had begun with fleeting touches and furtive smiles, was now something more, a secret they kept from everyone, but which burned within them like embers beneath ashes. Lily knew it was wrong, that she was betraying Tom, but in those moments, with Ryan looking at her and the music pouring from her chest, she felt alive, as if years of routine and fatigue were melting away in his gaze. "Lily, you're on fire tonight," Ryan said when the song was over, his voice low and husky in a way that made her heart beat faster. He came closer, adjusting the strap of his guitar, and his fingers accidentally or not so accidentally grazed her wrist. She smiled, looking away to hide her blush. "Just warming up. The festival is just around the corner. I need to be on top of my game." "You're already on top," he said, his eyes lingering on her a little longer than necessary. "And after the festival, who knows? Maybe this is your ticket to the big world, Lil. New York, Chicago. You can do it all." Her smile faltered. She had dreamed of this, of scenes that didn't smell of spilled bourbon and old wood, of crowds that knew her name, of a life where she wasn't just Tom Rivers's wife, but Lily, a star. Ryan had seen that dream in her, fueled it, and with every word he said, she believed more and more that he could be a part of that new life. But somewhere deep inside, guilt stirred, like a shadow she'd tried to ignore. She brushed it away like a fly and turned to Ryan. "Don't get cocky, boy," she said, trying to return her tone to playfulness. "We have New Orleans to conquer first." "Oh, we'll win him over," he replied with a wink, his voice full of promises she didn't want but so desperately wanted to hear. Tom stood in the shadows, at the entrance to the room, where the stage lights didn't reach. His arms were crossed over his chest, his face impassive, like the mask he wore when he needed to hide what was going on inside. He watched Lily and Ryan, their brief glances, the way she laughed at his words, and each moment was like a needle piercing his heart. But he didn't let the pain take over. Instead, he channeled it, like a musician who knows that dissonance can become part of a melody if played correctly. Tom was a master of control. He helped Lily with the arrangements, discussed the choice of songs with her, and suggested ideas for the stage persona. He spoke to her as if nothing had changed, as if he were still the man who had once danced with her on an empty stage to the sounds of an old gramophone. But every gesture, every word, was part of a plan that he had laid out with cold precision. He checked everything, from the synchronization of the videos that Jean was preparing to the reaction of Louis, the festival organizer, who called him every day to clarify the details. "Tom, are you sure your technician can handle it?" Louis asked during one of these calls, his voice full of enthusiasm, but with a hint of concern. "This is a big stage, Tom. If anything goes wrong, it's on us." "Don't worry," Tom replied, his tone as calm as the surface of a lake before a storm. "Everything will be perfect. Lily deserves a show to remember." Louis laughed. "You always knew how to put on a show, Rivers. Well, I trust you." Tom hung up, his lips curling into a small smile, but there was no warmth in it. He knew Louis trusted him, knew no one would suspect a trick. His plan was like a jazz composition, complex but harmonious, each note leading to the climax he had already seen in his mind. New Orleans prepared for the festival as if it were a celebration to eclipse all else. The streets were covered with posters with Lily River's name shining alongside other stars. Tourists wandering Bourbon Street stopped to take pictures of the posters, and locals in cafes argued over who would be the star of the show. Lily was the talk of the town, the Blue Crescent singer whose voice was said to make even the hardest of souls cry. She was a local legend, and now the whole city was waiting to see if she could be more. The atmosphere in the club was tense but energetic. The waitresses joked that Lily was already rehearsing her Grammy speech, and Morris, the saxophonist, grumbled that all the noise around the festival was keeping him from concentrating on the music. But even he couldn't deny that Lily was on fire. Her rehearsals were like performances. She sang with such passion that even the cleaners stopped to listen. She chose songs that spoke of love and loss, dreams and pain, and every time she sang, the room was filled with a magic that couldn't be explained. Tom was helping her, as always. He sat at the piano, picking out chords, suggesting tempo changes or pauses to heighten the drama. "Right here, Lil," he said, his fingers brushing the keys. "Take a breath, hold it, let the audience feel like you're holding them in your hands." She nodded, smiled, thanked him, and every time their eyes met, she saw only support in him, or at least that's what she thought. She didn't notice how his smile didn't reach his eyes, how his voice was a little colder than usual. Lily was too caught up in her dream, too blinded by the light she thought was waiting for her at the festival. One night, after another rehearsal, Lily stayed late at the club. Tom was in his office, checking the last details with Jean when she walked in, her face glowing with exhaustion and excitement. "Tom, I just talked to Ryan," she said, sitting on the edge of the table. "He thinks we could make an album after the festival. Can you imagine? A real album, not just a demo for the local bars." Tom looked up from his laptop, his face calm, but inside he felt his plan coming true. "An album? This is serious, Lil. Are you sure you're ready?" "Ready?" She laughed, her voice full of life. "I was born for this, Tom. You know that." He nodded, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. "I know, and I'll do everything I can to make you shine at this festival. I promise." Her eyes sparkled, and she leaned down to kiss his cheek. "You're the best, Tom. I don't know what I'd do without you." He smiled, but his smile was a shadow, empty, cold. When she left, he returned to the screen, where Jean had loaded a new montage. Footage of Lily and Ryan, their furtive glances, their touches, mixed with her old performances of her singing about her love for Tom. The contrast was stark, like the knife he was about to plunge into her dreams. The city lived its own life, but for Tom, every day was a step towards his goal. He met with Jean in secluded corners, checked the synchronization of the video, discussed the details of the scene with Louis. He was like a conductor who knows that his orchestra will play flawlessly, but only if every detail is in place, and he left nothing to chance. Lily, meanwhile, was on top of her world. She was rehearsing late into the night, choosing the dress that would become her signature at the festival, discussing with Ryan which songs could be on their upcoming album. She didn't see Tom watching her, didn't hear his voice grow quieter as he talked about her success. She was too busy pursuing her dream to notice that the stage she had been so eager to get to was already turning into a trap. New Orleans on the night of the Crescent City Jazz Festival was a living heart, beating to a rhythm you'll never forget. The streets of the French Quarter were a swirling tide of light, sound, and movement. Streetlights cast a golden glow on the wet pavement, where puddles still sparkled from the afternoon's downpour, and the air was thick with the aromas of freshly brewed jambalaya, sweet rum, and the tart smoke of shrimp grills sizzling. Music was everywhere, from the shrill notes of a clarinet to the deep rumble of a bass, and crowds of people, from tourists in bright t-shirts to locals in straw hats, moved in a chaotic but harmonious dance. The festival wasn't just an event, It was the soul of the city, a moment when New Orleans showed itself to the world in all its wild, untamed glory. On the main stage, set up in Jackson Square, where the spires of St. Louis Cathedral towered over the crowd like silent sentinels, everything was ready. Enormous screens on either side of the stage flickered, reflecting the faces of the musicians, and spotlights cut through the night sky like razor blades. The crowd, thousands of people who had come from all over Louisiana and beyond, was buzzing with anticipation for what promised to be the night's highlight. The Lily Rivers posters posted around town had done their job. Her name was whispered in cafes, discussed in bars, and mentioned by street vendors. She was a local star about to take things to the next level, and the city was waiting with bated breath. Lily stood backstage in a narrow space that smelled of dust and electricity. Her heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her fingertips. She wore a midnight blue dress with a low neckline that flowed over her figure like water. Her hair was in soft waves, brushing her shoulders, and she wore earrings the same ones Tom had given her all those years ago. She looked at herself in the small mirror hanging on the wall and smiled. Tonight was her night. Tonight she would prove that the Blue Crescent was just the beginning, that she could be more than just a singer at her husband's club. Nervous, Ryan's voice came from next to her, and Lily turned. He was leaning against the equipment rack, his guitar slung over his shoulder, and there was that fire in his eyes that always made her feel alive. His jeans were worn, his shirt slightly unbuttoned, and he looked like a man who knew the world was his. A little, she admitted, her voice soft but trembling with energy. "This isn't just a concert, Ryan. This is everything I ever dreamed of." He stepped closer, his hand lightly touching her elbow. "You're going to break this scene, Lil, and I'll be there to play along." She smiled, feeling the warmth of his touch, and for a moment she wanted to forget about everything, the crowd, the festival, Tom. But she pushed the thought away. This was her chance, and she wasn't going to waste it. She nodded at Ryan, straightened her dress, and turned toward the stage, where a roadie in a black t-shirt waved her off. Tom stood off to the side in the shadows of the crowd, his face hidden by the brim of his hat. He looked at Lily, but his gaze was as cold as the Mississippi in January. He knew this evening would change everything. He had spent weeks preparing for this moment, checking every detail, from the synchronization of the videos to the reaction of the organizers. Louis, the festival organizer, had clapped him on the shoulder when they had met backstage an hour earlier and said, "You gave her a show, Tom. It's going to be legendary." Tom just nodded, his lips curling into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Louis hadn't known that the legend he had in mind would be something completely different. Lily stepped onto the stage to a deafening roar from the crowd. The spotlights blinded her, but she was used to the light. It was her home, her element. She took the microphone, her fingers shaking slightly, but her voice was as hard as steel and as soft as velvet when she began to sing. She chose Fever, a song that always made the audience freeze. Pixels. System. Rat Deca. Her performance was mesmerizing, each word imbued with heat, passion, and something elusive personal that made everyone in the crowd feel part of her story. Lily sang, and huge screens behind her broadcast her face, her movements, her emotions, enhancing the magic of the moment. Ryan played alongside her, his guitar adding a sharp, brash edge to the melody that perfectly complemented her voice. The crowd swayed to the rhythm, some singing along, others just standing there, transfixed. Lily felt the energy of the room flowing into her, and her confidence grew with every note. She was on top, the queen of this city, and at this moment, nothing could stop her. Tom stood in the crowd, closer to the stage than usual, his eyes fixed on Lily, but there was no admiration in them, only a cold, calculating determination. He waited. His plan, laid out with the precision of a watchmaker, was ready to go into action. The technicians backstage, following his instructions, were waiting for the signal. Gene, the videographer, sat at the console, his fingers resting on the button that would start the show. Tom felt no anxiety, no doubt, only the certainty that this moment would be the final note of his and Lily's story. Lily reached the chorus, her voice soaring, filling the air with electricity. The crowd roared, and she smiled, basking in their adoration. The screens behind her showed her in close-up her shining eyes, her passionate gestures. She was a star, and she knew it. But then, at the peak of the song, the image on the screens wavered. Lily didn't notice it right away. She was too caught up in the music at the moment. But the crowd did. A whisper ran through the rows like a wind foreshadowing a storm. The screens flashed with footage not of her performance, but of another. Lily and Ryan, in a dark corner behind the club, their bodies pressed together, their lips locked in a kiss. The images came fast as punches, their hands intertwined in the secluded room, their gazes full of desire, interspersed with archive footage of Lily singing My Funny Valentine to Tom, her eyes full of love directed at him. The contrast was devastating, past and present colliding like two notes of discord. The crowd gasped, their voices merged into a roar, and the music on stage began to fade. Lily felt the change in the air, her voice wavering. She turned to look at the screen, her face pale. The images continued, she and Ryan laughing in the cafe, their fingers intertwined under the table. She singing to Tom about forever loving him, a smile that now seemed false. The audience froze, some looking away, others whispering, their faces full of shock, pity, condemnation. Lily tried to continue singing, but her voice broke, like a string snapping under the strain. She stood paralyzed, the microphone shaking in her hand, and the crowd, who had adored her a moment ago, now watched with cold curiosity. Ryan, who had been standing on stage, lowered his guitar, his eyes darting between Lily and the screen. He stepped back into the shadows, his expression a mixture of panic and detachment. He didn't say a word, didn't take a step toward her, he simply disappeared backstage, leaving Lily alone under the gaze of thousands of eyes. The musicians playing with her froze, their instruments silent, and the silence that followed her song's end was louder than any scream. Tom watched from the crowd, his face as still as stone. He saw Lily stagger, her hand drop limply to the microphone, her tear-filled eyes searching the crowd for him. But he did not move. His heart, once beating in time with her voice, was now as cold as the night. He turned and walked away, his steps disappearing into the murmur of the crowd, which was already beginning to disperse, whispering of a fallen star. Lily was left on stage, alone, under the spotlights that now seemed merciless. Her dream, her triumph, her life, all had crumbled in an instant, like sand blown away by the wind. She tried to speak, to explain, but her words were lost in the noise of the crowd. Her voice, once an enchantment to thousands, was now a faint echo, lost in the New Orleans night. The night in New Orleans was alive as the breath of a beast, and on this night Jackson Square was an arena where lives were broken under the spotlight. The Crescent City Jazz Festival was in full swing, the streets around the square thronged with people whose voices mingled in a roar like the rumble of an approaching storm. The aromas of roasting meat, sweet liquor, and the damp earth after a rain hung in the air, mingling with the sharp notes of trombone and the soft lilt of piano emanating from the small stages scattered around the block. But all eyes were on the main stage, where Lily Rivers, the singer whose name shone on the bill, had just lost her world. The stage, surrounded by a crowd, was an island in a sea of faces. Lily stood under the blinding lights, her night blue dress trembling in the reflections, the microphone in her hand feeling too heavy, like an anchor pulling her down. A moment ago she had been singing, her voice warm and deep as the waters of the bay, holding thousands in its power. But now the music had stopped, and the silence that followed her last note was deafening. The screens behind her, which had only moments before been showing her face, were now showing images that were tearing her life apart. She and Ryan, silhouetted in dark corners, their lips meeting in forbidden intimacy, interspersed with her old performances where she had sung about her love for Tom with such sincerity that it now seemed mocking. The crowd, which had recently been swaying to the rhythm of her song, froze. The hum of voices gave way to whispers that spread like sparks through dry grass. People looked at each other, their faces expressing a mixture of shock, curiosity, and something that looked like pity. A woman in the front row, wearing bright red lipstick and a straw hat, covered her mouth with her hand, her eyes widening. A young guy in a t-shirt with the logo of a local beer shook his head, muttering something to his friend. An old man with a cane, standing at the edge of the crowd, chuckled as if he had seen this before. But they were all looking at Lily, and their gazes were like 1,000 needles digging into her skin. Lily felt the blood drain from her face. Her cheeks, a moment ago flushed with the adrenaline of the performance, were cold as marble. She turned to the screens, her eyes darting over images that left no room for doubt. She saw herself, her furtive smiles at Ryan, her fingers touching his arm, her lips pressed to his. And next to her, another her younger, her eyes full of love, singing to Tom as if he were the only person in the world. The contrast was crushing, like a hammer hitting glass. She tried to speak, to explain, but her throat tightened, and the voice that had always been her strength betrayed her, uttering only a weak croak. "No," she whispered, but the microphone caught the sound and it echoed over the crowd, weak and pathetic. She took a step back, her heels slipping on the wooden stage, and she almost fell. The musicians behind her, the pianist, the drummer, the bass player froze, their instruments silent, their faces a mixture of embarrassment and confusion. They didn't know what to do, and their silence only reinforced the feeling that Lily was alone against the world. She tried to sing again, clinging to the melody like a life preserver. "Fever," she began, but her voice broke, the notes scattering like sand. The crowd was no longer listening. People were whispering, some were taking out their phones, filming the moment that would go viral on social media tomorrow. Lily felt her knees shaking, but she forced herself to stand up straight, gripping the microphone so tightly her knuckles turned white. She wanted to scream, to explain that this wasn't the whole truth, that she loved Tom, that Ryan was a mistake, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she stood like a statue, under the gaze of thousands of eyes that no longer saw her as a star, only a woman whose life had just crumbled before their eyes. Ryan Duper, standing backstage, in the shadows where the spotlights couldn't reach, stared at the screens with the same shock as the crowd. His guitar was slung over his shoulder, but his hands were still, his fingers frozen on the strings. He saw himself, his cheeky smiles, his touches, his kisses with Lily, and each frame was a blow. He wasn't stupid, he knew this was the end. His name, his face, his career, all would now be tied to a scandal he hadn't foreseen. Ryan was a man who liked risks, but this one was too big. He glanced at Lily, standing on the stage, her silhouette trembling under the spotlight. For a moment, he felt the urge to go to her, to take her hand, to say something that might save them both. But then he saw the crowd, their judgmental faces, their phones pointed at the stage, and he knew there was no salvation. He was no hero. He was a musician who wanted glory, not shame. Ryan took a step back, then another, his boots squeaking softly on the wooden floor. No one noticed as he turned and disappeared into the crowd backstage, his figure disappearing into the sea of people, like a shadow escaping the light. He didn't look back, didn't say a word, he just walked away, leaving Lily alone, under eyes that now saw her only as a traitor. Tom Rivers stood in the crowd, near the edge, where the light of the lanterns mingled with the darkness of the night. His face was motionless, like a mask carved from stone. He looked at Lily, at her pale face, at her trembling hands, and he felt nothing, no joy, no pain, no regret. His plan had worked as he had planned. Gene, the videographer, had done his job flawlessly, synchronizing the shots with a precision that any conductor would envy. Louis, the organizer, suspected nothing, thinking it was just part of the show. And Lily. Lily now stood on the stage, crushed, and Tom knew that this was only the beginning. He saw her searching for him in the crowd, her eyes darting around, filled with tears, but he didn't move. He wasn't going to save her, wasn't going to reach out to her. She had chosen her path, and he had given her the stage to play out her part. As the crowd began to disperse, their whispers turning to a roar like the sound of waves crashing on the shore, Tom turned and walked away. His steps were measured, sure, as if he knew he was leaving behind not just Lily, but a part of himself, the part that had once believed in their love. Lily remained on stage, her voice gone. She lowered the microphone, her shoulders slumped, and the spotlight that had once made her a star now seemed relentless, illuminating every crack in her soul. The crowd dispersed, taking with them the tattered remnants of her reputation, and Lily stood like a ship without sails, in the eye of a storm she could not stop. New Orleans was not a city forgiving of weakness. Its streets, steeped in stories of love and loss, were merciless to those who stumbled. After the night of the Crescent City Jazz Festival, the city seemed to hold its breath, not out of admiration but out of curiosity, like vultures circling over carrion. Lily Rivers, who had been a star yesterday, her name shining on the billboards, was now an echo, fading into the noise of the French Quarter. Her voice, which had once made the crowds freeze, was a ghost, her name a headline for gossip that traveled faster than the wind off the bay. Lily walked down Bourbon Street, her heels clicking on the uneven pavement, but the sound was lost in the cacophony of buskers and drunken laughter from tourists. She was still wearing the dress she'd worn to the festival, the color of a midnight sky, now wrinkled and dusty. Her hair, once styled in soft waves, was tangled from the damp air and the tears she couldn't stop. She clutched the bag she'd thrown a few things into as she left the stage. The crowd that had applauded her hours earlier was now parting, avoiding her gaze as if she were a leper. She could feel their eyes, not the admiring ones of old, but cold, full of judgment, or worse, pity. She didn't remember how she got to the Blue Crescent. Her feet led her to the familiar brick facade, where the sun-bleached sign still promised music and magic. But the door was locked, the heavy padlock hanging on a chain like a symbol of exile. At the entrance, under the dim light of a lantern, stood a box containing her things, a couple of dresses, a cosmetic bag, some old music books. On the box lay a sheet of paper, folded in half. Lily took it with trembling fingers, unfolded it, and read the words in Tom's familiar handwriting. "The stage is yours, but not here." She froze, her breath caught as if someone had ripped the air from her lungs. The note fell from her hands, caught in the wind, and swirled across the sidewalk until it disappeared into the shadows. Lily knelt down in front of the box, her fingers brushing the old dress she had worn the first time she and Tom had performed together. They had sung a duet, their voices flowing like the Mississippi, and the audience had looked up at them as if they were gods. Now the room was closed to her forever. Her world, her stage, her home, all gone, leaving only this box and the cold pavement beneath her feet. Lily lifted her head, her eyes still wet, searching the dark windows of the club for something familiar. She wanted to scream, to knock on the door, to beg Tom to open up, to listen, to forgive. But she knew he wasn't there. Tom was gone not just from the club, but from her life, and the thought was like a knife stabbing her in the heart. She stood up, picked up the box, and wandered away, her steps slow, as if each step were tearing a piece of her soul away. The streets of the French Quarter, usually so vibrant, seemed foreign to Lily now. She passed the cafe where she had once had coffee with Tom, laughing at his jokes about the local musicians. Now the cafe windows reflected only her lonely figure, and the waitress, recognizing her, quickly looked away. Lily turned onto Royal Street, where a street fiddler played a tune as sad as her thoughts. She paused, listening, and for a moment she wanted to sing, to reclaim the voice that had once been her strength. She opened her mouth, but instead of a song, all that came out was a hoarse sound, weak and broken. Her voice, her gift, her magic, all were left on that stage, under the spotlight that had illuminated her shame. She pulled out her phone, hoping for just one text, one call from a friend, from a colleague, from someone who would tell her this wasn't the end. But the screen was full of social media notifications, and each one was a blow. The video from the festival, where her life had fallen apart before thousands of eyes, had spread like wildfire across the internet. The comments were relentless. What a twist! How could she do this to Tom? A star has fallen and no one is surprised. Some wrote sympathetically, but their words were drowned out by the torrent of ridicule and condemnation. Lily tried to reply, to type a post, to explain that it had been a mistake, that she hadn't meant for it to end this way. But her fingers were shaking, and the words she typed seemed empty even to her. She threw the phone in her bag, her chest tightening with a sob she couldn't let out. She called Morris, the old saxophone player, who had always been like a father to her. but his phone was off. She dialed Sophie, the waitress who always joked with her behind the counter. Sophie answered, but her voice was cold, distant. "Lily, I'm sorry, but I don't know what to say. Maybe you should take a break." A pause. The word cut like a blade. Lily hung up without saying goodbye. She knew Sophie wouldn't be the only one who would turn away. New Orleans was a city where reputation was worth more than gold, and Lily had just lost hers. Lily wandered through the streets, not knowing where she was going. She passed the bar where she had once performed with Tom, their voices mingling in a duet that had made the drunken patrons weep. The bar was full now, but no one called her in. She stopped by the Mississippi, its waters lapping lazily at the shore, reflecting the lights of the city. Lily sat down on a bench, her box of clothes beside her like a silent reproach. She tried to sing quietly to herself, choosing Blue Moon, the song Tom loved best. But her voice shook, broke, and each note was like a shard of glass scraping her throat. She fell silent, hugging herself, and for the first time in years, she felt as if her music was dead. As the night wore on, the French Quarter came alive. Street performers played, tourists laughed, and Lily sat in the shadows, her figure blending into the darkness. She remembered Tom telling her that New Orleans was a city of stories, and every story had a price. She had paid hers, but she didn't know if she would ever be able to start another. Autumn in New Orleans was soft as a breath, but with a melancholy undertone that permeated everything from the damp air to the faded colors of the French Quarter. The days were growing shorter, and dusk was falling over the city like the curtain before the last act of a play. The streets that had once been bustling with tourists and music now seemed quieter, as if the city were preparing for winter sleep. Lily Rivers walked along sidewalks where every stone held echoes of her past. Her steps were slow, uncertain, like those of someone who had lost not only the road, but also herself. She was a shadow of the woman who had once captivated the crowds at the Blue Crescent, whose voice had made hearts beat faster. Now her hair, once radiant, was dull and pulled back into a loose bun, and her coat, too thin for the drizzle, was soaking wet, clinging to her shoulders. The months after the festival passed in a blur. Lily tried to cling to the remnants of her life, but they slipped away like sand through her fingers. The Blue Crescent, her home, her stage, was closed to her forever. Friends who had once laughed with her at the bar now looked away, their voices cold when she called. Social media, which she had once loved for its praise and concert photos, had become an arena of condemnation. The video of her performance at the Crescent City Jazz Festival, where her betrayal was laid bare, spread across the internet, garnering thousands of views and comments, each one a blow. A star that faded, betrayed her husband and herself. How could you disgrace yourself like that? The words burned her like hot coals. She tried to respond, to post, to explain that it hadn't been that simple, that she had lost herself the moment she chose Ryan. But her words were drowned in a flood of ridicule, and soon she stopped trying. Lily moved into a cheap apartment on the outskirts of town, in a neighborhood that smelled of damp and neglect. She took odd gigs at small bars where the drunken regulars barely listened and the owners paid her pennies. Her voice, once flowing like a river, was now cracked, weak as an echo. She sang, but every sound was drenched in pain, and even the simplest songs seemed foreign to her. Ryan was gone. He hadn't called or written or shown up since that night. She heard that he'd gone to Memphis or maybe Nashville, but she didn't care. He was part of her mistake, the part she wanted to forget, but which haunted her with every glance of the porch row. System. In the mirror, in every nightmare, in every empty room where she tried to sing. Lily knew that Tom had left New Orleans. Word in the music community traveled like the Mississippi wind, and she had heard that he had sold their old house on the edge of the French Quarter and was starting a new life somewhere else. But she couldn't accept that she had lost him forever. Tom was more than just her husband, he was her partner, her collaborator, the man who knew her better than she knew herself. She clung to the hope that she could explain, that she could give back some of what they had lost. That hope was leading her now, in the drizzle, to their old house, the two-story cottage with peeling paint and a creaky porch where they had spent so many nights planning a future of music and love. She had learned that the house was for sale from an old acquaintance, Louis, the festival organizer, who had casually mentioned it to her in a cafe. Louis was one of the few who had not turned away from her completely, but even his tone was guarded, as if he feared that her shame was contagious. Lily didn't blame him. She blamed herself. But the thought that Tom might still be in town in their home lit a spark in her. She had to see him, had to tell him that she was sorry she had lost herself the moment she allowed Ryan into her life. She didn't know if he would forgive her, but she had to try. The rain was picking up, changing from a fine drizzle to a steady, cold downpour that ran down her face, mixing with the tears she no longer tried to hold back. The cottage sat on a quiet street surrounded by old oak trees, their branches bending in the wind as if mourning her past. A for sale sign hung on the fence, slightly askew, and Lily felt her heart tighten. She climbed the porch steps, each step pounding in her chest like a drumbeat. The door was locked, but the light in the living room window was on, and she knew Tom was there. She knocked, softly at first, then harder, her fists pounding the wood as if they could break through the wall between her and the past. The door opened and Tom stood before her. His face was just as she remembered it, sharp features, eyes the color of river depths, but there was a weariness in them that had not been there before. His hair, slightly gray, was damp from the rain, and his shirt, carelessly unbuttoned at the neck, was damp around his shoulders. He looked at her, and his gaze was not angry, just empty, as if he were looking at a stranger. "Lily," he said, and his voice was low, even, without a trace of the warmth she had once heard in it. "What are you doing here?" She took a step forward, her fingers curling into fists to stop the shaking. "Tom, I need to talk. Please, give me 5 minutes." He paused, his hand hovering on the doorknob, as if he were debating whether to slam the door or let her in. Finally, he stepped aside, gesturing for her to enter. Inside, the house smelled damp and empty. Furniture was covered with sheets, boxes lined the walls, ready to be moved. It had been their home, but now it felt foreign, like a stage she had left forever. Lily stood in the center of the living room, her coat dripping onto the floor, leaving dark stains on the faded hardwood. She looked at Tom, searching his face for any hint of the man who had once danced with her under the stars. "Tom, I know what I've done. I know I've ruined everything we had. But I came here to tell you I've lost myself. Ryan was a mistake, a moment of weakness. I didn't mean to betray you. I want to make it right." Her voice shook, but she forced herself to speak, the words flowing like a river breaking through a dam. "I was stupid, Tom. I thought I could be more, that I could escape the routine, all of this." She waved her hand, indicating the house, their life. "But I realized that everything I needed was here, with you. Please, give me a chance. I'll do anything to earn your trust back." Tom looked at her, his face a mask. He stepped toward the window where the rain was pattering against the glass, and his fingers touched the sill where they had once carved their initials in a fit of youthful love. "Lily," he said at last, his voice quiet but heavy as lead. "You think this is about Ryan. It's not about him. It's about what you chose. You chose not just him, but another life. A life where I wasn't there. It's not like that." She stepped toward him, her hands reaching out but freezing in midair, not daring to touch. "I'm confused, Tom. I thought I was losing myself, that I needed something new. But I was wrong. I want us. I want what we had back." He turned, and there was weariness in his eyes, mixed with something she couldn't quite place, not anger, not pain, but something deeper, as if he were looking at her across a chasm she'd dug. "Lily, you don't understand. I gave you everything. I built this club for us, for your voice. I lived for your music, and you took it and threw it in my face like it was nothing." Her tears flowed freely now, mixing with the rain on her cheeks. "I know, and I hate myself for it, but I can change, Tom. I can be who I was. Please believe me." He shook his head, his lips pressed into a thin line. "You've chosen your rhythm, Lily. Now dance alone." The words hit her like lightning. She opened her mouth to protest, but he raised a hand, stopping her. "I'm not angry, Lily. I'm just tired. I can't be the one to hold you while you search for something else. I'm leaving. This house, this city, it's not mine anymore. It's not yours." He turned toward the door, his steps heavy, as if he were carrying their entire past on his shoulders. Lily wanted to scream, to run after him, but her legs felt like lead. She watched him step out onto the porch, into the rain that was now pouring down, washing away the last vestiges of her hope. The door closed behind him with a soft click, and Lily was left alone in the empty house, her tears falling to the floor, mixing with the water running off her coat. She sank to her knees, her hands clasped around her head, and she began to sob not softly, but loudly, heartbreakingly, as if she could cry out all the pain, all the guilt, all the emptiness that had settled in her chest. She realized that she had lost more than just Tom, more than just their love. She had lost herself the Lily who had sung with joy, who had believed in their dream. Her choices, her weakness, her hunger for something more had destroyed not only their marriage, but her soul. The rain pounded the roof like a metronome, counting down the end of her story, and Lily knew that the rhythm would haunt her forever. Memphis greeted Tom Rivers with a cold wind blowing off the Tennessee River and a rhythm that was nothing like the pulse of New Orleans. The city moved at a different pace, less chaotic, but just as vibrant, saturated with the blues that filled every alley and bar on Beale Street. It didn't have the damp, tangible magic of the French Quarter, but it had something else, a hard honesty, as if Memphis wasn't trying to pretend to be anything more than it was. Tom stood on the porch of his new club, the second note, breathing in the air that smelled of asphalt and barbecue smoke, and for the first time in months, his chest wasn't in pain. The club was small but cozy, brick walls covered with posters of old blues shows, wooden tables darkened by time, and a stage modest enough not to distract from the music. Tom had poured everything he had left into the place. The money he had from selling his house in New Orleans, the energy he had once spent at the Blue Crescent, and the hope that here he could start over. He wasn't looking for fame or fortune, he wanted peace, a place where music was just music, not an echo of betrayal. And Memphis, with its rough chords and straight eyes, seemed the perfect refuge. Tom had changed. His hair, now a little longer and thicker with gray, fell across his forehead, and his eyes, once blazing with passion, were now calmer but deeper, like the waters of a river hiding its currents. He smiled at the new musicians, joked with the bartender, a local boy named Danny whose smile was wider than a bridge over the Mississippi. But the scars of the past remained invisible but palpable like cracks in old vinyl. Every time someone mentioned New Orleans or jazz, Tom felt a sting, but he had learned to hide it with a small smile and a change of subject. He didn't talk about Lily, he didn't talk about the festival, he didn't talk about how his revenge, carefully planned and flawlessly executed, had left a bitter taste in his soul. The nights at the second note were lively. The room filled with locals, their faces marked by the weariness of the workday, and tourists seeking the authentic Memphis blues. The musicians on stage changed, from young guitarists with bright eyes to old men whose fingers knew the strings better than they knew their own names. Tom stood behind the bar, pouring whiskey and beer, making sure the stage lights were soft and the sound was clear. He was in his element, but his role was different now. He was no longer the star, the king of the stage, as he had been in New Orleans. He was the man who created space for others to shine. One night, as the rain pounded the roof of the club and the place was packed, a young singer named Ella came on stage. She was in her early 20s, with short, curly hair and a voice that was both fragile and powerful, like glass ready to shatter, but able to withstand a storm. She sang an old ballad, Stormy Weather, and her delivery was so sincere that the room fell silent. Even the rowdy guys at the bar stopped laughing. Tom stood at the bar, his hands hovering over the bottle of bourbon, and listened. There was something in her voice that reminded him of the past, not of Lily, but of how he had once believed in music, in its power to heal. Ella sang, and Tom smiled slightly, feeling something inside him, long forgotten, begin to thaw. He was freed from the pain, but the revenge he had taken left a quiet, bitter note in his heart, sounding in the pauses between the chords. Meanwhile, in New Orleans, Lily Rivers was a shadow of her former self. She lived in a small apartment on the outskirts of town, where the walls smelled of damp and the windows looked out onto a vacant lot littered with rusting cars. Her voice, which had once captivated thousands, was now confined to seedy bars where the crowds were too drunk to listen and the owners paid her just to sing. She sang old songs, Blue Moon, Summertime, but every note was laced with weariness, as if her soul sang not for joy, but for survival. Memories of the festival haunted her like ghosts, appearing in every mirror, in every blank stare of a passerby. The video of her disgrace still circulated online, and every new comment was like salt in a wound. Lily tried to start over. She took jobs as a waitress, sang on the street for tourists, but her voice, once radiant, was now a pale shadow of its former glory. She saw people recognizing her, whispering behind her back, and each whisper was a reminder of what she had lost. She wrote letters to Tom, long ones, full of words of forgiveness and regret, but they came back unopened. She called Morris, Sophie, even Louis, but their replies were short, cold, as if they were afraid that her failure was contagious. New Orleans, the city she had once loved, had become a cage for her, where every corner was a reminder of her fall. One night, standing on the banks of the Mississippi, Lily tried to sing. She chose My Funny Valentine, the song she had sung for Tom in their early years. But her voice shook, broke, and she fell silent, looking out at the river, its waters reflecting the lights of the city. She realized that her music had died that night at the festival, and no amount of trying could bring it back. Lily sank to the cold ground, her fingers clutching a pebble lying by the water, and she began to cry quietly, soundlessly, as if even tears were tired of her. At the second note, the evening was drawing to a close. Ella finished her ballad, and the audience burst into applause. She bowed, her cheeks pink with excitement, and walked off the stage to find her friends waiting with smiles and hugs. Tom looked at her, his lips twitching in a smile, not the kind he gave to tourists, but a real one, almost forgotten. He felt that Memphis had given him a chance he had not expected. He had not forgotten Lily, the pain she had caused him, the revenge he had exacted. But he had learned to live with it, like a scar that no longer bled, but always reminded him of itself. Tom stepped out onto the club's porch, breathing in the cold air that smelled of the river and smoke. He looked up at the stars, which seemed brighter in Memphis than in New Orleans. Somewhere out there, in another city, Lily sang her songs, but they were no longer his melody. His story with her was over, and the second note was his new score, not perfect, but honest. He turned to go back into the club, where the music continued, and in that moment he felt, perhaps for the first time in years, free. Whoever watched to the end, you are the hero of our script. Throw in an idea for a new episode, and you will be in the credits. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think click to the next one.